what I also am interested in is York as a club because let's face it, it was a roller coaster for many of your formative years. As you said, York had reached the second division and they were, at that time, Chelsea were there, Villa, I think Man United. So big clubs. They got to 15th in the second division, which is the highest they've ever been in the league ladder.
Yes.
But then, as you say, they started tumbling down. And this was the latest episode in a tumble, although surprisingly, they survived re-election because nearly everybody survived re-election for reasons we all know, because of the club that, you don't ever vote for your mate's club because you could be in that same position next year. So it was a bit of uh, it was a closed shop basically.
Yes.
But in that the rhythm of York, so going down, and then there are moments when obviously you went out of the league, but as you say, there were the heights of beating Arsenal in the FA Cup, beating Man United 3-0 at Old Trafford. I mean, remarkable. But then in between going right down, having to come back up through playoff finals. So that ebb and flow is something I think makes you as a supporter. If you're a Man City fan and you've only been going for the last 4 or 5 years, that you don't get it. And Man City, let's face it, have been in the third tier themselves not that long ago.
Richard, I've seen York City beat Manchester City in a league game when in theory they're playing as equals. So that to me emphasises why the English football structure is so important and why the pyramid is vital and why this notion that the top clubs should have it all their own way without going into the territory of FA Cup replays and all that sort of thing is just a nonsense, because the strength of the game, as we all know, is that pyramid structure. And I think, spending a lot of time at Premier League grounds as you do, you meet an awful lot of very entitled supporters that think that their club, as of right, should be in the top four of the Premier League. And if they're sixth, good God, they're having a dreadful season. Well, get real. Get real. To be a proper football supporter of a proper football club with a beating heart, you need to have experienced the tough times as well, because otherwise you don't enjoy the good times.
Exactly right. And it gives you a sense of perspective. So, as you say, if you've tumbled down the divisions, then getting a victory against one of your bigger opponents in terms of size of club is something to really savour. And if you're a member of the big club, you don't really feel that way. So, are you a collector, John? Did you collect programs? Did you always have a scarf, a hat, whatever?
Yes, I've still got the scarf. It comes out from time to time. It's red and it's red and blue, so it still fits the colours. I've still got a woolen bobble hat. It's a little bit the worse for wear now because it's probably 45 years old. I've still got some of the old programs. I've also got some older ones that predate my supporting of them as well. So I've got, for example, some of the programs from the run to the FA Cup semi-final in 1955 when they lost in a replay to Newcastle, who went on to win the cup. So I got the program from those two semi-finals, the semi and the replay. They were called the Happy Wanderers, and they were the sort of touchstone. They were the reason that many York fans, when I was going, they were of an age that they'd seen that and had been captivated by that. Whereas the first really good era that York had when I was a fan was when they won the old fourth division title in 1983-84 with a record number of points. And that was a side where Dennis Smith was the manager who came from Stoke City, player manager to start with. And they had a wonderful centre forward called Keith Walwyn, who sadly died very young, who was just a terrific striker. John Byrne, who went on to play for the Republic of Ireland, Brighton and Sunderland. They were a really good team. And that was my sort of early glory era. It took 5 or 6 years to get there to see them have some success. But for the previous generation, it was that 1955 FA Cup run. And York in the FA Cup is something that was always spoken about because I think they'd had a run to the quarters immediately before the Second World War where they'd lost to Huddersfield in front of a record crowd of 28,000 at Bootham Crescent. And there were supporters in 1978 that had been there in 1938. So the baton gets passed, doesn't it, from generation to generation. So I feel I've sort of been able to at least touch and talk to people who've seen those halcyon days. And I've had a few of them myself that I've talked to my kids. You know, I've got 4 children. I won the battle with one of them to support York. Lost
25%, not bad, I suppose.
No, I mean, it's a daughter and 3 sons. The daughter really hasn't expressed any sort of interest in football and wouldn't even know the shape of a pitch. But of the 3 boys, all 4 of our kids were born in the hospital that now stands on the site of the old manor ground at Oxford. Yeah. So 2 of them have supported Oxford United. But one of my most difficult days was going to the 2012 playoff final at Wembley, which was Oxford against York. And I took my 3 boys, and Oxford won. And my 2, they're about 10 and 12 at the time, were crying on the way home. Well, let me tell you, even though I had fatherly responsibilities, they were nearly turfed out of the car and told to walk all the way home.
Yeah. So your York, the one who took up the York baton, is that the eldest, or where is he in the pecking order?
It's the youngest.
The youngest. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's the youngest, and he's at Newcastle University at the moment. He's the one of ours that's still in education, and he's still eager to go and watch York whenever he can. And of course, being in Newcastle, it's reasonably convenient on the train. So it's nice that he has that, and I'm so delighted that my kids are not into the big clubs, which is nothing against the big clubs, but I just think they'll have a far more fun football supporting experience following York or even Oxford.
Yeah, as you say, when you said you only have one, and then I was a bit worried that you were going to have a Man City or a Man United.
No, Richard, no. What do you
absolutely.
think I am?
No. It's fine. It's fine. Relax, John. It's okay. Oh. Anyway, so I usually do this, and I don't know if you do have the programme for your game, but it's here.
Oh, wow.
In my hand, and it's going to make its way to you, because this is just a small token of appreciation for your time. So you look at this, it was 10p, the official programme, and quite frankly, there isn't a great deal to it. It's quite small. It's only 8 pages. It's completely black and white, but as a memento, it's lovely, and that you've got obviously got the lineups at the back. You've got, I rather quite like that Charlie Wright, the manager, and whoever thought of this is brilliant. His column is called The Right Note. And in a way, that's very relevant for you and your orchestra comparisons, The Right Note.
Yeah.
And so that's, that is your first game, and that set you on your path. So you said you went pretty regularly. Was there any season where you went to nearly every game? And I always think it's interesting to know when you go to your first away game, it is quite exciting. So when you go on the coach or the train or whatever it might be, can you remember that first away game?
I think it was a cup-tie at Altrincham. At that time, York, we talked about their annual visit cap in hand for re-election. And they were a considerably poorer side than many of the teams in the leagues below them. So they were very vulnerable in cup ties. So I remember going to, in those early days, Stafford Rangers, Altrincham, Carnarvon Town, some fairly out of the way places. I remember losing at Altrincham. And I think it would certainly be one of my first 2 or 3 away trips. And it felt quite embarrassing. And really, it shouldn't have done, because Altrincham were actually a really good side at the time. They had a guy called John King, who was a sort of piratical captain and centre-back, who was an inspirational figure. And I mean, they got to the stage where I think they beat Birmingham, who were then in the top division in the FA Cup in round about that era. So they were actually a really good side. But turning up at, I remember Marston Road, Stafford, Moss Lane, Altrincham. I can't remember the name of Carnarvon Town's ground, but going to these places, which were nothing like Football League grounds, and seeing the side humbled was tough going. But it was part of that formative era, and it just made me appreciate seeing them beat Chelsea, Manchester United, Manchester City, and Arsenal all the more when it finally happened. But I still although I am very much a one club person, I will still go off to a non-league game from time to time because I love the environment. And part of that love was born of those experiences of going to those grounds in those early days.
Yeah. And, you spend quite a bit of your time in the States now, but how often can you get to see York games? And you're obviously doing a lot of commentary, so it must be quite difficult to, clear your diary, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, it was more difficult. I lived for 5 years in the United States, so then it was more difficult. And I would go periodically when I was home. I would get home 2 or 3 times a year. Now I'm living back in the UK, so it's a little easier. So I think I've seen York 3 times this season, for example. It's just difficult fitting them in. It usually needs to be a midweek when there isn't Premier League or Champions League or something like that. But it's always lovely to go. And I still see some of the faces that I was seeing 46 years ago. I think if they were still at Bootham Crescent, I'd know where to find them. Now they've obviously had to relocate inside a new stadium, but I still do see some of the people that were watching that game against Newport County all those years ago.
Yeah. The same for me at Palace. I've been going for 50 odd years. And actually one of the people I see quite regularly is a guy called David Payne, who was a player there, and he goes to the same pub before the game and he's still chatting away. And it's just lovely when you see a player, that's your idol. And then suddenly you're next to him or in the main stand with him or just in the pub having a pint. And there he is. It suddenly smacks you as, obviously, I'm of an older generation now, but to see those players still coming to the games is fantastic. So I wanted to move on to a couple of other things apart from your first game that you went to see as a spectator. Mm-hmm. Do you remember your first game that you did a commentary or a report on for the radio?
Yeah, I mean, the first game I ever reported on for the radio was a Gola League game. So the Alliance Premier League, which was sponsored by Gola, now the National League. Yeah. And it was Scarborough against Barrow, which was a 0-0 draw. The attendance, I think, was 502 at Seamer Road, the athletic ground, the old home of Scarborough, who again were renowned Cup and FA Trophy fighters and were battling to get in the league, but they were having a bad season. So I got started in broadcasting at the age of 19 by accident, really by playing in a cricket match one day, getting a few runs, retiring to the bar afterwards, having a few beers, and then the payphone in the corner of the clubhouse rang, and it was the local radio station wanting to interview me about my innings that day. And fortified by several pints of Tetley's Yorkshire Bitter, I did this interview, thought no more about it, put the phone down, went and had a few more drinks. I didn't know what I was going to do with my life at the time. I just left school, academically hopeless. So I did this, thought no more about it. 2 weeks later, phone call at home, local radio station. We heard your interview a couple of weeks ago. I thought, crumbs, what did I say? What have I done wrong? And there was a pause. And then they said, actually, we really liked it. You sounded very fluent. Well, Richard, you'd have sounded fluent if you'd had the sheer quantity of Tetley's Yorkshire Bitter that I'd had that evening. So they said, we're looking for a few people to report on a bit of football and rugby this weekend, with this coming winter at weekends. We're just setting up a sports department. This was BBC Radio York, newly on the air. There's no money in it, but we like the sound of your voice and we think you might be quite good at it. Do you fancy giving it a try? So I said yes. And 24 hours later, I was packed off, having been given a tutorial on how to use a tape recorder to do interviews, to the athletic ground at Scarborough to do this midweek game between Scarborough and Barrow. On a payphone. There was a payphone in the press box that you would file your reports on. So I did this and it went well. And 6 weeks later, there was another phone call to say, you're doing quite well at this. Are you enjoying it? And I said, well, yes, I am. It seems very easy because I'd not really had a chance to give it any thought. I just did what seemed natural. No one had given me any great tuition. And they said, well, we think you've got a chance of making a career out of this. So if you go away to university and do a degree, because the BBC will only take graduates, or at that stage they would only take graduates, we'll give you matches to cover at weekends. And as long as you train on, we'll give you a job at the end of it. And that's basically what happened. So for 3 years, I managed to get myself on a degree course at a Catholic teacher training college on the outskirts of Leeds called Trinity and All Saints. Best known in football terms for being the college that John Moss, the referee, also went to. It's no great claim to fame, but he went there. I did a course called Communication and Cultural Studies with Public Media, which I suppose would be the forerunner of a media degree, but there were elements of psychology and sociology to it. And at weekends, I would go off and report on matches for BBC local radio. And that's what happened. And 6 weeks before my finals, there was a phone call from the HR department of the BBC in London, basically offering me a job. I mean, telling me that there was a job for a sports reporter coming up at BBC Radio Leeds, and that they booked me in for an interview. And these were the questions they were going to ask me, and these were the answers they would quite like me to reproduce. So who knew? I got the job, and that was me started. But that first game was Scarborough against Barrow in the Gola League. The first Football League game that I reported on was Leyton Orient against York at Brisbane Road. In, I think, September of 1984, York won 3-1. John Byrne was a goal scorer, the Republic of Ireland international. I do remember that. Yes, then, I was doing matches for Radio York and Radio Leeds, so covering Leeds, Huddersfield, Bradford. My first staff job with the Beeb was covering those teams at Radio Leeds. And then at the end of 1989, having done that for 18 months, I got offered a job by the National Radio Sports Department in London. All the sport was then on Radio 2 at the time, because Radio 5 and Radio 5 Live hadn't come around. And I went there really as a presenter to start with. I did that for a while. And within a few months, I was going as the host for the World Cup in Italy in 1990, presenting all the programs. But what I really wanted to do was commentate, because that's what I'd done in local radio and really enjoyed it. And so my first national radio commentary happened by accident when Mike Ingham, great radio broadcaster of many years standing, and the former football correspondent, went down ill on the eve of an FA Cup fifth round tie at the county ground between Swindon and Aston Villa in 1992, I think. And he went sick the night before, and the only person they could get that could travel to Swindon in time to call the game was me. So I did it, and I was lucky to have Martin O'Neill as the summariser. And anyone that knows Martin and how loquacious he is will know that there wasn't much required from me that day. So we got through it, and it made a few people sit up and take notice, and they thought, he's got a chance as a commentator. And I gradually switched from being the presenter in the studio to being the commentator. So that was my first national radio game. In 1995, John Motson went on a year's sabbatical, and they needed to bring in a young commentator on Match of the Day just to fill in the games he wasn't doing. So my debut for them in September of 1995 was Coventry against Nottingham Forest at Highfield Road. And you, as a Palace fan, you should probably know, it may not interest you, but I'm very grateful for it, that the reason I got that gig on television, and therefore the start of my TV career, was that I was the radio commentator at Selhurst Park the night that Eric Cantona jumped into the crowd. And the head of television sport, Jonathan Martin at the BBC, was listening in his bath to my commentary that night, with Mark Bright as the summariser, who contributed 3 words to that moment. As I described Cantona leaping 2-footed into the stand, Mark Bright's contribution was, "Oh my God!" And that was it. So that got me my TV gig. So I have happy memories of Selhurst Park for that reason as well.
Well, I was there, and I was actually in the stand where he jumped over. So I was a bit further back, but I didn't know what had gone on, really, because we were so far back. We knew there'd been a kerfuffle, and obviously Cantona had been sent off because he'd kicked Richard Shaw. But I've told this story a few times. The thing was, in those days, I travelled back home because I lived in North London, so it was a bit of a trek home. And there wasn't any coverage of it. And I got home, and then suddenly I got back for the 10 o'clock news, whatever it was. And there it was, a little bit right at the end saying, incident at Selhurst Park. And suddenly you went, we seem to be centre of the news here. How fantastic is that? I mean, it was I think I'm right in saying it ended up as a 1-1 draw. But again, it's these incidents that you can so clearly remember, but it's the circumstance more than the actual physical incident quite often that is so important in getting established in your brain. So I wanted to go back to you when you were commentating on Leyton Orient, York City. Did you retain any objectivity when York were hammering Orient?
I don't know about hammering. Yes, yeah, and it's both. I mean, it's something that's drilled into you, particularly in that era at the BBC. Impartiality. And it stayed with me throughout my career. So the word "we" would never appear in a broadcast if I'm covering a football match. And I've had a few York games over the years to do. I mean, I did the second leg of that Manchester United League Cup tie alongside Jimmy Armfield for the radio, and had to be objective that night as York went through in memorable fashion. Even though they lost the second leg, they'd done well enough at Old Trafford to go through. But that impartiality, I do think it serves you well. I feel uncomfortable if I hear a commentator referring to "we," unless it's a club channel. If it's a national broadcaster, I don't think there's any room for "we" and "us." So in the age where now pundits are open about who they do support and are asked by some broadcasters actually to show that support on the air for their team, I don't feel very comfortable with that at all. But it does give you quite a dispassionate view of football, and it means that when I go to a major tournament, I mean, I've been lucky to do 9 World Cups so far, and you'll sit there, and even if you're doing England, it's not even with England, it's not "we" and "us." It's not. It can't be. You've got to maintain a little bit of objectivity, I think.
Especially when you've got Ali McCoist next to you, because he won't allow you to talk about "we," will he?
No. Well, he'll be too busy talking about Immanuel Kant or something like that to get into partiality.
Exactly right. Now, talking of World Cups, can you remember the first World Cup finals you actually watched on television? Is there a clear memory of that?
They're not clear memories. I remember the 1978 World Cup and all the ticker tape, and the great Argentina team, and various other aspects of that tournament, but not with any great clarity. I just remember the experience of this exotic World Cup being on television. I mean, my earliest memory of a televised game would be going around to visit my aunt and uncle in Harrogate, who just bought a colour TV, and we watched the 1973 FA Cup final on that. So I would have been 7 going on 8. Ian Porterfield, Jimmy Montgomery's save, Sunderland Leeds. So that would be the starting point for watching football on television. But that wasn't as a football fan. That was just as a kid that was taken along to see this wonderful newfangled thing called a colour TV.
Yeah, and you got Bob Stoker and his raincoat and his hat.
Yeah,
actually, when you watch that Montgomery save, it is absolutely incredible because it was a double save, wasn't it? And you just can't believe he actually managed to. I think he flicked it onto the bar, but again, these things that get established in your head, like the Ronnie Radford goal, which wasn't actually the winning goal, but it's the goal that everyone talks about. It's just fabulous. And your first match abroad, because obviously you, as you say, you spent 5 years in the States and you've been to many, many, many World Cups and Champions League games. So can you remember the first match you went to outside the UK?
First match I went to outside the UK. That's a really good question. It would probably be. It's rather a big one to start with. I have a feeling it was probably the 1990 World Cup final.
Wow. Okay.
Because my gig with the BBC as the presenter meant being in the studios that they set up in Rome with the studio guests, and then you would throw for the run-of-the-mill games, as much as they are run-of-the-mill in a World Cup, to the venue, and it would be Mike Ingham or Alan Green or whoever was commentating, and Jimmy Armfield, for the sake of argument. But I think for the final, we broadcast the final from the Olympic Stadium in Rome, and I went to that. So I'm struggling to think that I would have been to a game overseas before that. I wouldn't have been, because local radio, the Heysel band was on, so sides weren't playing in Europe in those early years of local radio for me. And then I wasn't a commentator when I joined BBC Radio 2. I was a presenter, so there was no real reason to go to games. I I suppose actually maybe the 1990 FA Cup final. I might have got to that ahead of the World Cup final. But if you're looking for games overseas, yeah, World Cup final, 1990. So it was downhill from there, really, Richard, in that respect.
Well, it wasn't a great game, was it? But it's
No,
quite a good place to start, wasn't it? World Cup final.
Yes.
Brilliant. So I'm interested as going back. One last thing is this passing it down to your children. I've managed to pass it down to my son. He is a Palace fan, and he always will be, which is good. My two daughters take a vague interest because they know what mood I'll be in, and their brother will be in if Palace win or if they lose. And you've got two Oxford fans. You've got a daughter who hasn't got any interest. Did you take your three sons to their first game at York, and then, or was it at Oxford? Where was the first game for all three of those?
The first game for all three of them would be York.
Good.
Yeah, and it was a very deliberate policy, which makes it all the more disappointing that two of them have disappeared to the dark side of Oxford. But I kind of understand it because they've grown up in that area as well as being born there. But it's nice that I did have one victory.
Yes. Well, you've got to, as we said before, you've got to celebrate your victories when you have a few defeats surrounding it. So the joy of the odd victory, I think, is greater than, endless cups and champions.
Yes.
You know exactly what I mean. So just the last question, I always usually throw this at people. You love football. You've been involved in football. You're lucky enough to work in football. That first game, you've been haranguing your parents. They weren't going to let you go because you had to go to your orchestra practice, and you managed to persuade the family friend to take you. Is there one thing that absolutely got you when you went to that first game, and is the thing that really was the hook that you've been on ever since?
The communal experience. The fact that you are part of something that many others, whether you measure that in tens, hundreds, or thousands, are going through at the same time. And therefore, particularly if you're at a big game, you're watching the nation's conversation of the next 24 hours unfold, and you're there and you're part of it and you're witnessing it being written in front of you. So that's the thing. And that day, 7th of January 1978, above the smells and the taste of the Bovril and everything else, it was to be in that swaying mass behind the goal, all experiencing this at the same time. It was the first time in my life where I'd been to something where everyone was having that experience, and they were therefore able to compare notes about how they were interpreting what they were seeing, and to see the emotions that it generated as well, the way that it can lift the human heart. I think that's what completely captured me then, and still does now, really.
Excellent. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for taking us from. I think the orchestra's loss is our game, and if you'd still been playing your fiddle, we wouldn't have had that fantastic journey from Bootham Crescent to the Olympic Stadium in Rome. So, Jon, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure having you on It Started With a Kit podcast, and I wish you many more fantastic experiences in the football world.
Well, Richard, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you. Lovely to reminisce. And thank you also for the match programme, because I don't have that match programme, or I didn't have that match programme. And that means more to me than I can say. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.